We're good to go. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Matwyshyn. I have the honor of being the Microsoft Visiting Professor at Princeton CITP this year. It's been very exciting, and I'm having a fantastic time with the pleasure of meeting all of you. And today I'm going to speak with you a bit about a book that I'm working on a topic that I believe will become increasingly important as we continue to embark into the brave new world of the Internet of Things and our interconnected reality of the future. And that's the question of tinkering children and the way that we create a legally optimal regime in addressing the challenges that children present with some of their boundary pushing, but also recognizing their incredible value add in terms of creativity and their capacity as creators, which the law has traditionally under-recognized. So there in a nutshell is the topic. And with that, we begin. This is Simon. Simon is 3 years old. And as you can tell, he has spectacularly good taste in monkey pajamas. They don't come in adult size, I already asked. Simon is the son of my star JD MBA student and her husband, who's a CFO. And my ex-student is a tech company CEO. And so it's true that Simon's growing up in a very technology-connected household, but watching kids like Simon, I realized there was something fundamentally different about the reality that these children are living in and the way that they're interacting with this reality. So within the first 10 minutes that I walked into Simon's abode, Simon turned on the Roku, pulled up a browser window, started his favorite Muppets videos on YouTube, reprogrammed the connected refrigerator, and generally pushed every button in the house, in some ways creating novel programming regimes that his parents had trouble unwinding. And these are technology sophisticated parents, right? So Simon is the next iteration of what other scholars have called digital natives, and what we all may remember, those of us who are now old, I shudder to say, remember the VCR phenomenon of the blinking zeros, where the children in the household were the only ones who knew how to program the VCR. So this is the next iteration, 2 generations down, kids like Simon. Also, kids like SciFi here. So SciFi was 10 when she discovered a flaw in a game at a hacker conference that was teaching kids how to build and pull apart systems in order to help themselves defend their privacy and security. And she found an error in programming that the adult programmers had absolutely missed. Similarly, there are numerous examples of teenagers and preteens finding vulnerabilities in even widely dispersed products and now being awarded bug bounties for them. In fact, we saw companies such as Microsoft and Google think about how to evolve their bug bounty programs to specifically contemplate the reality that kids are sometimes the finders, and kids lack contractual capacity because they're under the age of 18. So they need mom or dad to sign the bug bounty agreement, even though the child is the finder of the flaw. Here we have a famous case. Pinkie Pie, the teen in question, is now over the age of majority, but he was still a teen when he found a $60,000 worth flaw in Google Chrome. And so here we have one of the top security teams in the world still having a little bit of room for improvement that a teen found. We have teens who are building their own apps, well, in this case a little girl, and we have 10-year-olds who are becoming Microsoft certified. So this is the brave new world. One of the things that got me questioning these issues is simply the way that these kids, who I'll call Generation C, and I'll go into that a bit on a later slide, interact with physical reality. Some of you undoubtedly saw this meme that was going around of this baby interacting with a magazine and not being able to flip the page. The physical piece of paper, the magazine page, was a daunting obstacle because the child was using a gesture for the iPad. And so the primary reference point for this child was a technology-driven reference point, not the dead tree-based reality that we all started out with. So this is raising some interesting questions about development, particularly when we have children being increasingly incorporated into the day-to-day of our society, even by DARPA and the Department of Defense in some cases. So something is changing about the nature of childhood in our society, and it's connected to technology. For example, recently, if any of you live in Virginia or are familiar with the Virginia snow day that did not happen, we have demonstrations of kids who act out through technology and do some defacement damage to, for example, this school website as an act of protest. Schools, parents have challenges addressing the disciplinary questions that admittedly this conduct arises, but not killing the skills that it simultaneously displays and the potential for creation that it signals if the child is directed in a good way. So some of this is a question of striking a balance between putting up boundaries updated for from traditional contexts to technology-driven contexts, and also managing a situation where the kids may have superior skills to the adults around them. So here's the basic question that I'll unpack in multiple sections. Is current technology law and policy helping these cyborg kids to succeed in their development and in their self-development? Because as any of you who code know, much of this is self-developed. It's sitting in front of a machine and trying to tinker your way into expertise. Or are our current policies in some ways setting our children up to fail? So, the generation of Simons, I'm calling it Generation C, which isn't my term. It's been floating around in the interwebs stratosphere from consulting work and other places. But the C in Generation C I like because it allows for kind of a linguistic play. It could mean many things. So Generation Computer, Generation Cyborg, and all of these other terms that are sometimes demonstrative of positive qualities that these children exhibit and possess, and in some cases raise some social policy questions and concerns. For example, the progressive commodification of our children's data from the moment of birth. And similarly, striking that balance between their ability to break things and their ability to build things. So here's the structure for the rest of our conversation today and for this book that will ultimately get written, I promise. I'm going to take us through some assumptions and some hard questions that will be determinative of the way that we want to build the future of technology policy with respect to our children and development in terms of technology, facility proficiency, and entrepreneurship of these kids. Then it'll be followed up with some proposals for tweaks that we can do to the legal system, to our educational system, hopefully to address some of the challenges that we will discuss. So let's take the first question. Basic question. Are these children really different? Does technology change children's development? So, while this may seem simple, there's actually a debate between two different schools of developmental psychology. And this is perhaps why our policy and parents and teachers are challenged by these policy dilemmas and issues. So first you have a linear notion of development that's represented by people like Jean Piaget. A child at age 2 will be less developed than a child at age 18. Draw a line. And then we create benchmarks based on that kind of a chronological evolution and guide development of kids in that way. But a different school of thought, one which I admittedly subscribe to, says, no, it would be nice if it were that simple, but development is actually a dialectic. It is a series, more like a series of concentric circles with different layers that simultaneously impact each other. And you see this in the work of people like Yuri Bronfenbrenner and Vygotsky and Albert Bandura, et cetera. So what this means is that a child's development is always context specific, in particular with respect to genetics, the family peers and school environments, the society the child is embedded in, the laws and norms that are pushing on the child, and in particular, technology. So the technologies that impact the development of a child in 2015 are fundamentally different from the technologies that impacted the development of a child in 1915. This matters, and this means that our policy prescriptions and our legal approaches need to take into account this kind of a development-sensitive paradigm. Next, do children still need buffers of protection? I just described some pretty sophisticated kids. Maybe we're just infantilizing them. Maybe they don't need the types of traditional protections that we've had for them in law. Maybe these are, in fact, different children, and my argument cuts the other way. They don't need that help anymore. My answer is yes, they do need that help. In fact, in some ways, they need it more, but differently. The reasons that existed for creating buffers for childhood previously still exist. Children are biologically not little adults. They are not yet developed. They don't have the processing capacity in terms of being able to make reasoned decisions, understand right from wrong in some cases. And the way that we as a society socialize and raise children is contingent on the fact that they are children. They're not short adults. And part of the problem here is that the law is confused. So traditionally, adulthood has been defined in different ways based on the body of law that we're looking at. And what's happened in this context of children and their interaction with technology is a set of dynamics that mirrored the dynamics in other technology law contexts. There were pre-existing tensions in the law, and now these questions exacerbate those tensions, rendering them more problematic than they previously may have been, forcing us to sort of come to terms with them. So as you see, different bodies of law treat children differently, and adulthood starts in different points in the child's development life cycle. So in particular, when we look at internet spaces, there are 4 bodies of law that are especially relevant: contract, copyright, free speech, First Amendment stuff, and privacy and information security law. All 4 of these legal regimes that control children's development and interactions in this space have different paradigms of childhood. They all view adulthood and childhood differently. So we'll walk through those quickly. In contract, usually the magic age is 18. So with limited exceptions, children up to the age of 18 and shortly thereafter can simply set aside their contracts, because the paradigm is a child protective one that says the adult in question is assuming the risk of transacting with a child, and therefore the child and the child's parents can assert this right to set aside contracts that the child executes. Even the most pro-contract and I don't want to say anti-consumer protection, but pro-freedom of contract scholars, one of whom is Eugene Volokh at UCLA, even that school of thought concedes that when we're dealing with an internet user who is a child or a consumer who is a child, in those instances, these types of contractual concerns and challenges are still valid, whereas they wouldn't be in an adult situation. So some of you may say, well, wait a second. Do we know if, for example, privacy policies are contracts? And so what I can tell you is that, that from my perspective, there's no question. Privacy policies and terms of use are the same thing. They're an embodiment of the totality of the terms that a user engages with the provider, the drafter of those terms. And so consequently, you have this data exchange that facilitates a meeting of the minds, and they're trading promises that trigger each other. While US privacy scholars may be conflicted on that point, the US contract law scholars actually aren't. We're all pretty much on the same page. A EULA and a privacy policy are either both contracts or neither is a contract. And so you have, slowly, a construction of this more protective world that contract law actually may provide for kids than we might have originally anticipated. And in particular, the FTC has highlighted that offline and online conduct is construed together when we're talking about privacy. And if you're interested in these issues, I have an article that I can give you a reference to. It goes into all of these arguments in excruciating detail. So, what about the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, you ask? That has contract-based approaches. It does, but unfortunately it uses the age of 13, which does not map onto contract law, which uses the age of 18. So in fact, traditional contract law may offer a more privacy protective approach for kids than the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Next, copyright. Copyright gives us a one-size-fits-all approach. Traditionally, children were not defendants, but the internet started to change that. Indeed, you saw kids remain as defendants in some cases, even when the parents were dropped. This means that children, by default, are considered equivalent to adult infringers when they transgress the strictures of copyright law. Meanwhile, the broader context is that when there even is a license, an intellectual property license, it may still be a problem if the child breaks the terms of this contract that, mind you, he or she technically shouldn't be allowed to agree to because of the minority question, or at least can set aside those agreements. Because the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the primary computer intrusion statute in the United States, the circuit courts, the upper level appellate courts, are divided on the question of whether merely a breach of contract can provide the basis for a charge of computer intrusion, a criminal charge of computer intrusion. Okay? So here is the broader context that's challenging. In particular, we have case law developing in perhaps suboptimal or inconsistent ways. In the Fourth Circuit, we have a case where children and their parents did not want to allow a third-party plagiarism software to archive the children's work product, and expressly modified the EULA and informed the school that the children's work was not to be retained by the third party. And despite that express disclaimer, the court in that case said that the school's ability and the third-party software's ability to archive that material was a superior interest to the students' right to control their own work product and or their privacy interest. When you have mandatory grading happening through these kinds of third-party applications, we start to see some of these uncomfortable tensions between the autonomy of the child, the role of the parent, and school administrators who are trying to do what's logical and provide the best education, but nevertheless perhaps have not thought through some of these implications and these tensions that exist in the law. Copyright, as we all know, carries possible criminal penalties that can be harsh. And the RIAA, which was the entity most interested in pursuing juvenile infringers in the last decade, that's likely true. To my knowledge, the RIAA was the entity most interested in pursuing juvenile infringers. Stated that the criminal charges leave you with a felony record accompanied by up to 5 years of jail time and fines up to $250,000. So indeed, the copyright holders who are pursuing children announce the severity of copyright penalties clearly as a method of triggering and incentivizing compliance. In addition to these traditional penalties, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act changes the dynamics of technology-driven intellectual property by adding another layer of possible criminal and civil responsibility, because merely disabling a copy protection measure, even if the underlying copying doesn't happen, that mere disabling is a violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Now, why this becomes a problem is thinking through the way that children interact with reality. They push all the buttons. They pull things apart. Who among us did not at some point disassemble some key household appliance or gadget that resulted in the family incurring, for example, a lack of coffee the next day, but nevertheless, that was a piece of the learning process. Now, let's flash forward the Internet of Things. The coffee maker's connected. The coffee maker reports to the creator of the coffee software that's embedded in the firmware that generates the magic lattes every morning. And the child touches the firmware, and the coffee maker sends out a distress call. Help me, I'm being touched inappropriately. Okay? So at that point, because of the connectedness of the device, the creator of the software has knowledge that someone in the house has touched the software in a way that the creator may find to be transgressive and infringing of their rights under copyright law. When it's the 5-year-old and copyright does not have a specific contemplation of children's conduct, which it doesn't, and copyright law doesn't really think about kids as possible creators, we have a world where the kids who are the brightest and most likely to engage with these gadgets to build the next generation of gadgets are also the most likely to get in trouble under these legal approaches that admittedly are well-intentioned and trying to reward creation of one sort, but creation by adults without perhaps contemplating the role of kids. Free speech. The third set of law is one where kids are admittedly treated as individuals with fewer rights. So under the First Amendment, the Supreme Court has recognized that there is a legitimate interest, particularly in school environments, for schools to set restrictions that preserve the integrity of the school environment in order to facilitate learning for the totality of the school community. Now, this preservation does have constitutional limits. So, for example, in 1969, a group of students wanted to wear black armbands to school, and the Supreme Court said that that constitutes speech that's protected and that the children should be allowed to engage in that. But by contrast, in 2011, in another case, a student's parody social media website of a principal was deemed to not be protected speech. So courts and schools are struggling with some of these challenges. In Pennsylvania, there was a situation where a school district enabled remote cameras on laptops that ended up spying on kids in their bedrooms, with the intention undoubtedly being to help recover the laptops if they're stolen, but there were these unintended privacy consequences that then some IT administrators apparently abused because there were images that were not appropriate, at least not in the name of reclaiming stolen property from bedrooms and such. And recently there's been concern where some school districts in Illinois are apparently alleging a right to demand social media passwords of students when there's a suspected incident of cyberbullying or other type of school altercation. So the line between the schoolhouse gates and the outside world is blurred. And that adds to the confusion because here we do have a direct contemplation of kids, but one that it's not clear which way it cuts. finally, the last body of law, privacy and information security. So we've already discussed the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which hinges around the age of 13 and says that data collection by websites that target children, targeting being a term of art, require affirmative parental consent for the collection and use of children's data under the age of 13. But as we discussed previously, contract law turns on the age of 18, and so there's perhaps a suboptimal match here. There are two traditional rationales for giving children a buffer of privacy, or really anyone a buffer of privacy. The first is this idea of intellectual breathing space, the ability to think thoughts in private and to process and evolve in your thinking to achieve a resolution, a thoughtful outcome without judgment happening in your early thinking. And the second is a more physical space notion of freedom from intrusion, someone physically observing and encroaching on your space. Kids' data collection is closer to the freedom from intrusion rationale, but children's tinkering is arguably closer to the breathing space rationale. The ability to teach yourself the next step in the evolution of your learning process. So the concerns that we saw in contract law about the reality of children not being able to process information and make decisions to the same caliber as adults, and the reality that adults sometimes unfortunately take advantage of children, the inability of parents to meaningfully supervise in many internet contexts, and I've previously argued that contract formation in internet contexts generally, even for adults, raises fairness concerns. So when you look at that bundle of issues around data collection of children, we see that there are some concerns. So this brings me to the question, are we setting kids up to fail? Unfortunately, I think under our current legal approaches, the answer is yes. So the charmer here, which I assume all of you recognize, is Bill Gates. And so this picture to me, it reminds me that the line between criminal and brilliant entrepreneur is a thin one. So in this case, this was some sort of traffic stop. But Bill Gates and the entrepreneurs of his generation learned to code, learned to create at a time before tracking, the Internet of Things, data surveillance was evolved to the point that it is now. And so in today's reality, where conduct is monitored to a far greater degree for kids, the conduct that Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, many other entrepreneurs point to as being that fundamental tinkering building block set that led them to figure out how to build in the future, that conduct today would probably be monitored, caught, and the children would have legal consequences. And so if we have a different outcome in 2015 for the same tinkerer who we agree created, at least I think we probably all agree, created something valuable in terms of entrepreneurship and a value add for society, we should examine that balance. What has changed, and how can we make sure that the next generation of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Ed Felton's tinkerers.
You're not going to bring out my checkered past, are you?
You know, I do use you sometimes in talks as an example of someone who undoubtedly tinkered in his past and went on to illustrious things. So I've removed you from this talk because I felt it would be, you know,
Okay.
maybe a little aggressive to
Just
reference you in slides. Yeah. Okay. So the question that I'd ask you to contemplate is whether we're creating a false dichotomy between the child criminal on the one hand, in the way that we're criminalizing certain types of conduct and tracking for the recognition of those types of criminal behaviors, versus this notion of the perfect child prodigy and entrepreneur that we all want to incentivize, because that's a good thing. Entrepreneurs are a good thing. We're all about entrepreneurship in this country. So these are the two extremes. But when you look at the legal regimes that we've talked about, and the policy responses, we're not getting either of those sides quite right. When we have a DC zeitgeist of criminalizing intrusion, computer intrusion, more aggressively without expressly contemplating children's participation in these kinds of tinkering acts that may have them run afoul of criminal prohibitions, when we have copyright law that doesn't expressly think about children as creators, in the name of ferreting out the child criminals, we may actually be simultaneously damaging the prospects of the most likely candidates for that next generation of prodigious entrepreneurs. So, with that, let me offer a few proposals and take some questions. I'll go through this quickly. One of my favorite sociologists is Erving Goffman, and Goffman tells us that people seek to impression manage. We try to create a perception of the identity that we want to grow into. This is something that children, it's a learned skill. This is something that children aren't intuitively knowledgeable about. And so that space for identity building is one of the most important elements that I think policy and law needs to contemplate when we're helping kids grow into the future successful citizens that they're going to be. Goffman also talks to us about stigma, the way that others perceive an individual and how that limits opportunities for social advancement. In a world where 7 years of Facebook statuses are archived and my 20-year-old students have to think about what they posted on Facebook at the age of 13 and whether that's going to limit their ability to get a Wall Street job, maybe that's not the optimal balance that we want in terms of helping kids grow and succeed. Particularly when the self, the identity of a kid, a child, is developed not only by the child, but by the databases and the data aggregators and the algorithms that aggregate, leverage, control, assess information that is not only provided by the child, but provided from other sources. We start to see a slippage in control by the child, him or herself, in the creation of that identity that the child at some point would like to grow into. So when we have this loss of control over virtual social identity, it means that certain types of social opportunities may get lost for the very kids that we can, with a bit of guidance and nudging, turn into perhaps the brightest and most successful members of our society. So thinking about children as creators, it's an affirmative thought process that to date hasn't necessarily been incorporated into our legal approaches. Teresa Amabile at Harvard has thought a lot about the creative process, and she points to the importance of discovering childhood talents through creative exploration, that is the nexus for uncovering the creative pathways that lead to adult success. Tinkering matters, particularly collaboratively, and money does not necessarily stimulate creativity. So creativity isn't something that you can just throw cash at when a child gets to age 21 and believe that we're not having a net loss of entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity in our society. That's just not the what the psychology of creation tells us. So thinking about children expressly matters. In particular, the ability to divorce one space of identity from another space of identity. This goes to the data aggregation point. And so a children's right to forget that maps onto contract law is a very basic type of improvement or acknowledgement that the law could make, which isn't radical. All it's alleging is that the doctrine of minority that's always existed in contract law similarly extends to digital spaces. And the law arguably gets us there already, but we haven't seen cases where this has been considered by courts or where litigants have made this argument yet. But it's a natural extension, I would argue. And technologically, the ability of companies to segregate this data, they should probably be doing it already if they're COPPA compliant. So this isn't a daunting technological task that will be too disruptive. Tinkering is this accumulation of learning episodes that builds on itself. And so the express consideration of the next generation of creation and entrepreneurship in our society is underpinning this entire conversation that we're having today. Specifically, the extension of the minority doctrine, which I've already discussed with you. The Federal Trade Commission can play a role by expressly or implicitly adopting a position that supports a children's right to unwind agreements and delete information. We should think about creating an exemption or an affirmative defense in copyright, both with respect to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the Copyright Act generally, around childhood, and to clarify or reform the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Computer Intrusion Statute, to acknowledge the reality that kids will be part of the population of criminals who transgress the strictures of that regime. And also to recognize that two teenagers defacing a school website because they're angry about a snow day is not equivalent to an international ring of credit card thieves who compromise 1 million computers through a botnet. Okay? So recognizing the granularity of the scale of both attacks and perpetrators is essential to not damaging the future of innovation in this context. Here's an article where I lay out some of these arguments with respect to the legal analysis. The last 2 points that I'll make briefly before I open it up for questions. Schools have a role here. I don't mean to exclude or diminish the importance of the school environment. To the contrary, in fact, you see innovation happening in classrooms, particularly in the UK and in other countries, where computing has become a mandatory piece of the curriculum, and every child is learning to code the way that every child is learning proper grammar. In the United States, we have not arrived to that point yet. We don't have cultural consensus on that. So looking to these international examples and thinking about how we can nudge our society toward that kind of technology fluency for kids and the next generation of creation, that conversation will also have positive ripple effects in some of the legal criminalization discussions that I mentioned previously. And finally, the role of non-traditional education is very important in these contexts. Schools are strapped and teachers are struggling to keep up with the knowledge to teach their kids about computing, and the kids frequently demonstrate skills that far exceed the skills of their teachers. And so the reality is that coding has always been a self-taught world from what I hear from my smart friends who code. And when you have the emergence of the maker movement and the breaker movement, which I think nobody would self-label that way, but you have child-focused conferences such as Roots Asylum at DEF CON, the Hack Kid Conference, and various hackerspaces where parents and their children together learn to break and rebuild technologies. And that kind of collaborative, non-formal, but structured environment offers a viable path for a different type of educational environment that nevertheless can convey many of the social values and concerns that underpin some of the legal discussion that we had previously. As a final note, I'll just offer this screenshot from Harvard Business Review, which reminds us that curiosity is as important as intelligence, and tinkering children are the embodiment of curiosity, something that we should be fostering and encouraging and guiding rather than over-criminalizing or discouraging. So thanks, and we have 4 minutes for questions.
It is a super project.